Putting the pressure on Hezbollah. First, the UK declared them a terrorist group, and now they're going after their money. Is Boris Johnson doing it to damage the organization or appease the United States? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Britain's decision to freeze Hezbollah's financial assets. Its name sits alongside some notable others on the United Kingdom's terror blacklist, including Sri Lanka's Tamil Tigers and the Basque separatist group ETA. But now that that list includes Hezbollah's already banned military wing as well as its political arm, Downing Street is upping the ante. It's putting its mouth where the money is, freezing the group's funds and prosecuting anyone who chooses to do business with it. But who is the real target of Britain's wrath, and why do this now? Haider Abbasi reports.
Hezbollah describes itself as the protector of Lebanon. But it's not just an armed group. Hezbollah is one of the most powerful political parties in Lebanon. The entire movement has now been blacklisted by Britain. The head of the UK's Treasury, Sajid Javid, has tweeted,
"We will take whatever action is necessary to tackle terror groups that threaten our security. Hezbollah itself makes no distinction between its military and political wings, nor do we."
The UK proscribed the group as a terrorist organization last year, and this month declared it was freezing all of Hezbollah's assets. The announcement was made just 2 weeks after the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was killed in a US airstrike in Iraq. Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah has sworn to avenge his death.
As for Qasem Soleimani, he is not just an Iranian concern. Qasem Soleimani is of concern to all of the resistance axis.
Britain getting tough with Hezbollah means it's getting tough with Iran. Tehran is the main sponsor of Hezbollah. It was Iran's Revolutionary Guard that helped to set up the group in 1982. It seems British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is trying to show his support for America's decision to assassinate Soleimani. US President Donald Trump has been criticized for killing the general. Johnson has also disparaged the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and called for it to be replaced by an agreement prepared by Trump. Some analysts have suggested that Britain's blacklisting of Hezbollah makes its leader a legitimate target for assassination. So what impact will the UK ban have on Hezbollah? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's go to our guests now. Joining me in Beirut is Jamal Ghosn, a columnist at the Lebanese newspaper Akhbar. In Dayton, Ohio, we have Randa Slim. She's the director of the Conflict Resolution Program at the Middle East Institute. And in Nottingham, England, is Afzal Ashraf. He's an expert on terrorism and global security at Nottingham University. Good to have you all on the program. Afzal Ashraf, is this worth Britain's trouble, taking on Hezbollah, taking on Iran? Is it worth the trouble if it means getting closer to the United States?
Well, it depends on what you mean by trouble. So far, Hezbollah hasn't troubled the UK, and it is unlikely to do so unless it wants to make itself much more vulnerable to retaliation from the US and other European countries. So what the UK has done in this is to bring a certain degree of consistency in its approach to Hezbollah by declaring the whole organization a terrorist organization and freezing its assets. And in so doing, it's also curried favor with the US, because that is what the US would like for European and other countries to do. So it has got a great deal of political gain from it. It has got some consistency in its policy, and it's unlikely to suffer any significant consequences at this stage.
Well, the EU, of which Britain is soon to not be a member of anymore, makes that distinction still between the political and the armed wings. Randa Slim, is Britain doing a more pragmatic thing here? Is it doing something that's less silly? The distinction is something that's almost impossible to do.
Hezbollah itself does not distinguish between the political and military wing. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General, is the Secretary General of the whole organization, including the political and military wings. And so, so in that respect, Britain is being consistent in terms of its approach to Hezbollah. If one part of it is terrorist or designated as terrorist, the whole organization, should be also designated as such, because the organization itself does not make that distinction. However, whether this, will this be costly for Britain? I think of all the activities, all the resolution motions that Britain could take, I think this is the least costly, especially in terms and cost benefit. It will get, for it, if you do cost benefit analysis, I think the benefits from participation for Britain is much higher.
Right, and it's probably harder to fight Iranian proxies on the actual battlefield than it is to squeeze some of their finances. Jamal Ghosn, Hezbollah is a large part of Lebanese society, a large part of the people who are actually running this new government or trying to run the new government. Is it actually going to hurt Hezbollah, given that Britain has upped the ante?
Well, I mean, we have to realize here, when they talk about freezing financial assets, we have to realize that Hezbollah has been off the global banking grid for decades now. They've been threatened with sanctions and sanctioned before, and they've always been chased basically by the US and the UK. So they do not run their finances through their banking system. They don't have their money in a UK bank waiting for Boris Johnson to freeze them. So they've moved away from that banking system for years. So it's not really going to affect them in any way financially, that's for sure. And when it comes to running the country, I mean, it would hurt the UK basically more to avoid talking to the Lebanese government of which Hezbollah is a member, because they have a vested interest in the country and they still want to guard those.
Right. Afzal Ashraf, I mean, Hezbollah doesn't just do things like hand out social grants and provide social services in places like Beirut. It is active on the battlefield in places like Syria, supporting Assad and so on. By doing this, is the UK saying it is firmer in its belief of strengthening the other side when it comes to the conflicts in the Middle East right now, the Saudis and their allies?
Yes, I think it's not so much the Saudis, but the fact that the US is part of the other side, as you put it. I think that the UK has had a strategic policy for many decades now that it would always be the alliance of first choice in political and military matters with the US. And if the US wants to take a particular line, sometimes reluctantly, the UK will provide some support. They have tried in the past to shape US policy and through back channels to have some degree of nuance, but in this current regime there doesn't seem to be any scope for it. And I think the UK is very careful about the battles it wants to fight with the US. So it is, for example, in the last day or two, it has gone partly against US advice in accepting a Chinese company to help with the infrastructure of the 5G network, the telephone network in the UK. It is certainly not going to sacrifice any brownie points, as we put it, or any credit with the US by going against Hezbollah in this case.
Jamal Ghosn, for those who believe that this might give the green light to put a target on Hassan Nasrallah himself, especially in the context of Qasem Soleimani being targeted recently, is that realistic?
I mean, as far as we know, for now, the UK was not involved in that. But if we move from in the assassination of Soleimani, but we have to keep in mind that Hassan Nasrallah has always been a target of assassination, and he takes extraordinary precautions to avoid that. That was not the case with Qasem Soleimani. The US took advantage of that. He was traveling openly in a civilian flight, and that's how it happened. This is not the case with Hassan Nasrallah. So this is not I mean, this is not, we're comparing apples and oranges here. But again, the UK, I don't think they want to be associated with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani or with any military action in Lebanon, because that would be something that they haven't done so far, and this would be something else. They would be really jumping in bed with the crazy rulers of Washington, which started something they don't know how to get out of.
All things considered, Randa Slim, by further sanctioning and proscribing Hezbollah by a UN Security Council member doing this, is this going to be better for the region or worse?
I think these sanctions have already been factored in to the security structure, as well as the political calculus of all the actors in the region, be it regional actors or extra-regional actors. However, I think what affects it is it eliminates communication channels. You know, even if Britain, even if the US considers Hezbollah as their enemy and consider them as terrorists, you know, I think, you need to talk with your enemy at some point. So it doesn't mean that sanctioning them should eliminate any kind of back channel communications, if possible. Now, whether this is going to push other EU countries to follow in Britain's footsteps. We know that last week there has been push by American officials in Brussels in meetings with parliamentarians, EU parliamentarians, to get an EU ban issued by the EU Parliament. I think there will be many challenges to that, because there are some countries like France that have some, and Italy, that have some of their officers, you know, part of the UNIFIL presence in southern Lebanon, that want to maintain these links and these communication channels with Hezbollah and find any kind of this kind of total ban unnecessary provocative action.
Yeah, it's probably easier for the German parliament to do it than it is for the French and the Italians, as you mentioned, Randa. With that in mind, Afzal, is it possible, do you think it's likely that the EU as a whole will make that call and take that extra step that the Americans want them to?
At this stage, I think I wouldn't want to make a prediction either way. I think, as you've described, there are tensions within the EU Parliament, and we may have to see how pressure is put on countries like France by the US to bring them in line, as it were. But I think the most important thing to remember is that this particular issue in the EU Parliament actually points to a potential harm or restriction that Hezbollah might face. Because if the EU countries stop or doing business with Hezbollah in terms of just normal goods, or if they're restricted from providing aid to Lebanon, which might indirectly go in to benefit Hezbollah, all of this will put direct pressure on Hezbollah, perhaps not to the extent that it will restrict it to any significant degree, but certainly to a degree that it will feel the pain, as it were. I think more importantly than that, whilst it is quite right that Nasrallah has been a target, and this is not going to make the chances of assassinating Nasrallah or other Hezbollah leadership that much easier. What it will do, and this is the important thing, in the West, there has to be some sort of ethical, legal argument for this. At the moment, it's very weak.
Right.
And I think this adds to that argument, that justification argument for any future action. And I think that is one of the primary drivers behind this move.
Okay. Afzal, Randa, and Jamal, good to talk to all of you. Looking forward to having you back on the program sometime soon. Thanks for joining us. When he became the first black leader of South Africa's mostly white Democratic Alliance Party, many believed Mmusi Maimane would be able to mount a serious challenge to the country's ruling ANC party. But last October, after 4.5 years at the helm, he left, citing his unhappiness with the DA's approach to racial inequality. Earlier this week, I spoke with Maimane about life after the alliance and what he plans to do next. I began by asking him about his vision of building what he sees as one South Africa for all.
Well, I think more than anything, as you know, South Africa's history is a fragmented history in terms of racial groups. So I've always felt that South Africa needs a movement of activists who will work together towards advocating for one South Africa, so that will work across all races. Advocate for the reforms electorally so that ultimately we can choose a government by the people. Then ultimately work harder at making sure we build an economy that is inclusive, that is future focused in terms of transitions into the green economy. And lastly, more than anything, to build a South Africa with a capable and an agile state rather than a corrupt one. So this movement has been established. It will coalesce a number of various political parties, NGOs, civil society, in order that actually as a united front, we can bring change that South Africa so desperately needs. And that is in many ways the project that we're working on.
You don't want to do it through the vehicle of a new party. You don't want to start a new political party, do you?
I believe that more than anything, South Africa has already got 48 political parties on the ballot box, on the ballot paper. It would not be helpful for South Africa to have 49 and 50. Therefore, what I'm saying is, let's work to bring more parties together so that united we can indeed stand. And ultimately, if you look at models, it was President Macron who got elected through a movement. If you went to Zimbabwe, not far from here, that corrupt government that was led by ZANU-PF was defeated by a movement for democratic change, the MDC. If you go to Kenya, it was the same instance. So I am saying South Africa is not too dissimilar. If we're going to liberate ourselves from the liberation movement, what we need is a movement of opposition parties that can work together towards bringing that change.
And why did you liberate yourself from the Democratic Alliance? Now, I know you explained yourself a little bit in a press conference. A lot of people have the question, was it because the DA was racist? Was it because ultimately they were using you as a black face to hide a white system that only served the interests of white people? Was that the reality?
No, I think South African body politic is such that you historically have got parties that represent particular racial groups. When I went into the DA, I firmly believed that the project we should work on is to build this one South Africa, is to build a party of all races. And subsequent to the elections in 2019, when it became quite clear that a populist agenda that sought to segregate people from various races actually was the one that got rewarded in the elections, suddenly there were people inside the DA, some of them, who felt it was important that they must retreat into that kind of space. It wasn't the intention, it wasn't the project. And when I left, I felt that if the success of the people who want to create a party that represents a particular view, a minority party, or in a particular stance, then that's certainly not the project I'm going to be engaged with. And in fact, I hold no issues with the Democratic Alliance. It must continue with its job. I am now committed to building this movement for one South Africa.
Okay, but as we look at the South African political makeup, right, the ANC historically, over the past quarter of a century, even though their vote has been going less and less and less and less, they still get over 50% of the vote. The DA was punching in the 20s or so, right? And then it was seen as, well, the theory was that with you at the helm, and with the DA reaching out to more black South Africans, the 80%, the majority of the country, the DA would be able to grow and finally challenge the ANC. It would stop being so corrupt. It would stop being so complacent that it just had everybody else's votes in the bag because it was the party of Mandela and so on. But let's look at it from this perspective then.
Yes.
Let's look at it from the perspective that South Africa's in trouble, the economy is in trouble, the rand is doing terribly, unemployment is at a disgusting level, the state-run enterprises are failing, and we had the ANC slowly losing power election after election and the DA gaining power. And you were at the helm of that main opposition party. Now the DA is going to lose some support because you've left, and Mr. Mashaba has left as well, and you've got to start again. You're building a movement from the bottom up. So congratulations. You've just probably handed the ANC another solid victory in the next election. How do you feel about that cynical, pragmatic political perspective?
Well, I think that is a gross miscalculation of how liberation movements are defeated in Africa. That is a misreading of the situation.
Tell me how.
Because frankly, it's not just about starting from the ground. It's about a coalition of various parties. So there's already foundation. Secondly, many South Africans, the biggest party in South Africa actually is not the ANC. It's the South Africans who didn't vote. And therefore, if you are finding yourself where democracy is losing its legitimacy by an increase of a number of a no vote, it becomes then incumbent that we go engage those no voters. And lastly, when I worked even in a city, a microcosm of South Africa like Johannesburg, the ANC was defeated through a coalition of various parties. So there is a dynamic upon which let the DA continue to do what it does, let the other parties do. But this movement, if it coalesces, it will stand a much better chance of, in fact, defeating the ANC. Because if we just keep status quo, keep the DA, the fact of the matter is that South Africa is running out of time. Therefore, you can't keep doing the same and hoping for a different outcome. Because as per your earlier scenario, we'll just keep going percentage after percentage, and the ANC keeping a dominant path on that. What we want is for church communities, what we want is for religious bodies, civil society, to then come together and work so that that change can be felt much quicker and much more urgently. Therefore, I'm confident that should this project be able to deliver the outcomes it will do, it will accelerate the process of change rather than simply incrementally simply saying, we'll wait for the DA in a landscape that is so racially polarized to ultimately get its own traction.
You came under a lot of attack by the EFF, Julius Malema especially, Mbuyiseni and others who are part of the EFF, by the ANC. When you were in Parliament and elsewhere, you've got a thick skin. A lot of them attacked you. Over the years, they felt, Mmusi, you are just a part of window dressing. You are being used as a puppet by Helen Zille and the whites who run the Democratic Alliance. And you yourself, you've said now that they appealed to populist sentiment within and among white South Africans. Do you feel like maybe Julius and maybe the ANC and others, maybe they were right to an extent? I was used by the DA?
No, I think that's... You must remember, liberation movements, particularly the ANC, have to tell citizens that they must liberate people still from something, a class, a race. It suited them to stand up and say anyone who opposes them is an agent of a particular force, and they frame the question before the electorate. Do you want a black party or a white party? Whereas I wanted to frame the debate as follows. We don't want black parties, we don't want white parties, we want South African parties. Therefore, within that framework, it was always going to be such that their only point of attack, because they can't point to corruption on my part, they can't point to incompetence on my part. They know both those arguments fall by the wayside. They can't point to the fact that we had a vision for South Africa that says that we can build an inclusive economy. They couldn't attack on that part. So the easiest is to paint us in a racial corner that is unhealthy.
Where do you feel that you made mistakes, especially during your time as the leader of the Democratic Alliance?
Yeah, I think like any leader, you make mistakes. That's part of the job of leadership. But leading a complex dynamic such as South Africa, perhaps there were times where I should have challenged more to say, especially to people who have got resources in this country, it is obligated upon them to be the first to lead in terms of sharing those resources. That the challenges of many black South Africans must cease becoming just the problems of black South Africans. They must become problems of all South Africans. And therefore, ultimately, so that all of us are engaged in opposing a system of exclusion so that we can include more people. And I think there were moments, perhaps, even in my tenure as leader, where I did not confront that issue strong enough and challenge particular sectors of society to say, the South African project is your project as much as it is the next person's. So yes, I think if I look back and if you say to me, prospectively, what would you do differently? Is to be much more vociferous on that issue, much stronger at saying, look, all of us have an obligation, particularly wealthy South Africans, that you must contribute to, in fact, the project of building this one South Africa.
Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.